Electric cars in California are losing the HOV lanes, and the $7,500 federal tax credit is going away as well. The state was planning to go zero emission by 2035. Did California make the wrong decision? Our guest today is Dr. Daniel Sperling, who's a key policymaker behind the zero emission movement. He's here to tell us what was happening behind the scene when California was making this mandate.
I think that was important. But the downside of that is it got a lot of people upset. It felt like government was telling them what to do, and it created a backlash.
California does have its own unique fuel standard. You have been part of this. Can you tell us more about that?
That's probably my most important contribution of my career.
Some people argue that this is increasing the cost of fuel.
That's how Tesla happened. Tesla would not exist today if it weren't for these credits that it was able to sell to the other car companies. When they first started selling their Model S, they were making about $20,000 from credits that they sold to other car companies for every car they sold.
I'm Siamak Korami. Welcome to California Insider.
Daniel, it's great to have you on. Welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
You're a big player in the low carbon emission movement in California. You have been behind a lot of policies. So we want to hear from you what's happening with the EVs, and then we get into your discoveries in the other fields.
Well, it's varying tremendously across the country and across the world. So there's a lot of pushback. With the Trump administration, they're taking away a lot of the rules. But so the question is, there's policy on the one hand, and there's the market and consumers on the other hand. And they're related, of course. And the politics and the policy are to roll back the requirements and the incentives and the regulations at the national level. And they're also forcing California to do it. On the market side, it's still a small market. Actually, in California, about 1/4 of the vehicles sold are electric vehicles. The big question going forward is there inertia? Are the companies going to keep marketing them? Are people going to keep buying them? Or are people just going to say, well, there's no incentives and President Trump doesn't like them, so I'm not going to buy them? We don't really know. This is the big uncertainty. I think if I was going to forecast, I'd say the most likely is it's going to stay flat for a couple of years, maybe slightly diminish. Because the car companies, these are global car companies. The rest of the world is transitioning to electric vehicles. These car companies can't just say, we're going to give up on electric vehicles. They've made massive investments. They have massive markets around the world. They're not going to let it go. So the question is, how much are they really going to stick with promoting electric vehicles in the US, in California? And how much are they going to possibly back off a little? They're not going to back off a lot, but they'll probably back off a little bit. And we're seeing announcements like that.
How much losing HOV lanes and the tax credit, the $7,500 tax credit, means to this market?
A lot of people have bought electric cars because they get access to the HOV lanes, especially down here in LA, I have to say.
All the traffic.
All the traffic, all the freeways. I know a number of years ago, one of our PhD students did an analysis and said having access to an HOV lane was worth about $4,000. And that's on average. So many people valued it much more than that. So I'm both an academic and a regulator, policymaker. I had 16 years holding the transportation seat on the California Air Resources Board, appointed by Governor Schwarzenegger and then Governor Brown, and then through into the Newsom years. So I've got a lot of experience seeing the real world, but also looking at it in terms of what's the science, what's really going on. And these incentives have had some effect, but I think it's overstated how much effect. I think it's almost more psychological. It's signaling. Because, if they see and they read that the government no longer is supporting electric vehicles, whether through carpool lanes or incentives, then people say, well, maybe I shouldn't buy one. But if everyone's saying, this is the future, This is what's good for you. This is what's good for California, what's good for America, what's good for the world. Then a lot of people say, okay, I'm kind of with history here. I'm not going against history.
In terms of the state wanting to go zero emission by 2035, was that an unrealistic goal or was it realistic in your opinion?
Okay, I was one of the leads on adopting that regulation, that requirement. So the way I look at it now is, okay, a few thoughts on that. One is by saying that we are going to 100%. The good news is it sends a signal to all the different stakeholders and parties that they need to start making adjustments. The electric utilities, the fleets that buy cars, the cities that do the permitting and provide parking. So it sends a signal that this whole ecological system has to coalesce around it. And so it sends a signal. If you said 80%, they might have ignored you. So 100% was putting a stake in the ground. And I think that was important. But the downside of that is it got a lot of people upset. It felt like government was telling them what to do. And it created a backlash. And so in the end, it was probably a mistake to make it so aggressive and absolute. Because the reality is, it could have been changed any time. In fact, I expect that within a few years of now, if it had stayed in place, within a few years, they would be going back to amend it and say, okay, well, maybe not 100%, maybe 80%, because there are circumstances. Some people really, an EV just doesn't suit them, or they're politically so ideologically opposed, they're never going to do it, and they're going to create chaos. So at the end of the day, if I went back, I would make it a soft 100% and then making it understood that it was flexible. But there was one other mistake about it. And this is an important thing for us in California. Like all people, we're parochial. So when California adopts a requirement, other states have the option to either adopt California or adopt the national requirements. And so something like 12, 13 states adopted California's requirement for 100% ZEVs in 2035. And the reality is they had almost no chance of meeting it. So if it was just California, I think we could have come close or might come close to 100%, but the other states not. California, we've invested a lot in building charging infrastructure. We have the HOV lanes for EVs. We really did. We had all of our governors from Schwarzenegger on all saying this is the right thing to do. This is what we're going to do. The messaging was clear and transparent and strong, but that didn't happen in other states. A few other states maybe, but no one like California. So we should have been less parochial. We should have said, okay, what we do in California is most important in terms of being a leader. What we do for climate change in California is really not so important because we're only 1% of the world's problems. But if 30% follow us, now we're having a big impact. And so we should have been more aware and sensitive to that and made some accommodations so that other states would be able to follow us honestly and realistically.
What about the infrastructure side of it?
Charging's a funny thing because most people that buy electric vehicles, at least so far, they have a house and they can charge at home. And people that have a house and charge at home, like 85 to 90% of their charging is at home. They do very little public charging. So it's almost psychological. It's like, I want to know there's chargers out there in case I run out of juice. I want to make sure that there's somewhere to charge. And so a lot of it's psychological, but psychology is important. That's how people make decisions, right? And that's what we have to be sensitive to. But we are getting to the point where people that are buying them live in apartment buildings, live in condos, where they don't have easy access to charging.
What about the infrastructure? Do we have enough energy for something like this?
We've spent many decades focused on efficiency, and very successfully. So we always said to the utilities, make sure that energy is used efficiently, and that way we won't need extra capacity. So the whole regulatory system, the policies, the rules, was all built around having fairly steady electricity consumption. But now we're saying not only do we need more electricity for cars, we need it for trucks, and even more, we need it for data centers and AI, and electrification of buildings has taken place. So now this whole paradigm of how we treat electric utilities is transformed. And the utility, the whole regulatory structure, the whole mindset, the bureaucracies, they're not prepared for it. They've not been set up to build more capacity. And that's the struggle we're having now. And the bigger problem is with the data centers right now, more than with vehicles, because that's increasing much faster rate than the electricity being used by vehicles. So we'll see how that plays out. You'll see there was a law just passed, or it's gone to the governor, that will connect the California grid to the other grids, to the other states around us, to create a more robust electricity grid. You know, we had the thing that we got all this solar and wind, which has been great, but we have too much solar at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but then these other states need it. So now we'll be able to transfer it to the other states and make money from it, as opposed to they were giving it away for almost free at times.
This was very ambitious, right, to go electric, or buses. And some regions are doing that, but they're facing difficulties, right?
Right.
What were you guys thinking about trucks?
Okay, while I was there, we adopted a rule that said by 2035, a large number of trucks need to be electrified. So it was 40% of the big rigs, the long-haul trucks, and 70% of the more medium-sized trucks. And I think that was fairly reasonable, because it turns out that some applications of trucks and cars make more sense for electricity than others. So for trucks, you look at those Amazon, FedEx delivery trucks, they go about 100, 110 miles per day, every day. So total huge amount of mileage they do, but not that much, and not too much in any one day. So you can get a truck with a smaller battery. So batteries are what's really expensive. Smaller batteries, and so that means the truck costs a lot less. And you're using it so much that you save a lot of money on energy, because the electricity is cheaper than the gasoline or diesel. So the application, the delivery van application, is a no-brainer. You saw Amazon made a purchase of 100,000 of them a few years ago from Rivian, because that's a perfect application for it. Now those big long-haul trucks, that's more problematic, because they go long distance, you need massive batteries, charging is difficult, and the batteries are heavy, so you can't carry as much because there's a weight limit for the trucks. So I think what we did back in, I believe it was 2020, I think was a good rule. But then they got carried away, the regulators got carried away. They changed it to be a requirement for 100% truck of all trucks by 2036. And I think that was a mistake. And that's where they went too far. It was after I left, by the way. And of course, now they're both thrown out by the Trump administration. So it's unclear what's going to happen with the trucks at this point. It's clearly going to grow much more slowly. It's going to continue growing in the delivery truck range, these trucks that are 10,000 to 15,000 pounds, smaller vans, that make deliveries. That's going to continue because it makes sense cost-wise. The companies make money. It's a winner. And the drivers like it. It's quiet, it's smooth. So the drivers love it. The drivers compete to have the electric trucks. I've talked to many of the UPS and Amazon drivers, and they all say they want the electric one. But without the requirement for the manufacturers to sell them, And right now, there's also not the incentives. The market is going to be pretty flat for a while, and it's going to be limited more to those, trucks like the Rivian electric trucks, and then Ford makes this transit van that's very popular, electric also. But the rest of the applications are going to suffer.
There was a point where they wanted to, for every truck that would come into California, then there needed to be X amount of electric. Like for every 9 or 10 trucks you would bring in, you had to be one electric, right?
What I learned in the regulatory world, so when I was an academic, and I did lots of research on air pollution and electric vehicles. And so when I joined the board in 2007, appointed by Arnold Schwarzenegger, I thought, this job is going to be a piece of cake. I know everything that needs to be known, typically arrogant academic, right? Well, I got there, and I probably knew 20% of what I had to know, because it gets so hard to do good policy. When we decide as a city, a state, a country, what's important, figuring out exactly how to deliver on it is really hard. There's this book, Abundance, by Ezra Klein. He talks about how, California has really tied itself in knots by not providing permits, not streamlining the permitting of new infrastructure. High-speed rail is the poster child they use. But they don't come up with solutions. What do you do about this? What's important to us? How do we come up with ways of making sure people are healthy? How do we make sure that, just sticking in my swim lane here, how do we make sure the communities are not suffering, adversely, that are near ports and railroad stations and so on, near warehouses? How do you make sure that we really start reducing greenhouse gases and be a leader, but doing it in a cost-effective, smart way? And they don't have answers in that book. And it's a bestseller. Everyone embraces it. I go, okay, great. I largely agree, but what do we do about it? And so the question about exactly how do you orchestrate this transition to electric vehicles? Because in the end, electrification is going to happen for sure. It's a good thing, not only because it reduces pollution and greenhouse gases, but it also because economically it's the best thing for the consumer, for the country. So we're not quite there yet. In some cases like the Amazon, they are there. It makes sense in every single way. But for a lot of applications, not. And so we're kind of trying to figure out, how do we move forward? Not too fast, not too slow, the Goldilocks moment.
California does have its own unique fuel standard. You have been part of this. Can you tell us more about that?
I'm glad you asked that, because that's probably my most important contribution of my career. Back in 2007, Governor Schwarzenegger contacted myself and a professor from Berkeley, Alex Farrell, and said, we just adopted this law about, climate change, and we've got to do something about the fuels. And, in his mind, it was like, okay, we want to help out agriculture in California too. But he said, can you two come up with a policy or a regulation that will help us in this transition? So he and I spent like 6 months with a team of about 15 to 20 graduate students, postdocs, professors, and we came up with a plan, and we worked. Okay, this is an example how you can do good policy. So I'm a big believer in transparency, but sometimes it goes too far. So we met with all the oil companies, the electric utilities, the NGOs, the environmentalists. We met with the Canadians because they had a lot of oil they were exporting to California, and they were worried we were going to regulate it out of existence. We spent 6 months meeting on Saturdays during the week, and we came up with this plan we passed it over to the Air Resources Board, and they ended up adopting it almost exactly how we designed it. And it was really vetted. So what this does is it says, we are going to reduce the carbon footprint of our transportation fuels. And what it does is it tells the refineries every year you have to reduce the carbon intensity of your fuels just a little bit. And if you can't do it or don't want to do it, you can buy credits from someone else. So the someone else would be someone that sells low carbon natural gas, like the dairy digesters, dairy farms in the Central Valley, or from the electric utilities selling electricity for electric vehicles. It's been, at first it was very controversial. In fact, almost everyone hated it, I have to say. It was kind of disappointing. And it was almost, destroyed and blocked by the legislature. But over time, all these different entities started to realize there was value to it. So SoCalGas started saying, oh, wow, now we have a path to the future. We can buy this low carbon natural gas, what we call renewable natural gas, and we can put in our pipelines and we can stay in business. And utilities, it gave them an incentive. And the biofuel people, gave them an incentive. And so it became very popular and very effective. And one of the outcomes has been 2 oil refineries. I know you want to talk about oil refineries. 2 oil refineries actually shut down their oil refining and switched to biofuel refining, what we call renewable diesel. And this is just in the last couple of years or so. So now in California, when you buy diesel fuel, 75% of it is not from petroleum. It's from biofuels, from plant matter. It's not fossil. And that's kind of something that people don't talk about or know about. So, and that was because of the low carbon fuel standard. And so it's kind of I'm a policy wonk, or I became one as I got older. And something that's happened with regulations, what we've learned is you don't want command and control regulations. No one likes to be told what to do, right? Whether you're an individual buying a car or a company selling oil or a company selling cars or trucks. You don't like to be told what to do. So what we do now is we give them a performance standard. Okay, say you got to reduce your emissions X amount. And we don't care how you do it. And if you can't do it, you can buy credits from someone else. So what it does is it harnesses market forces. It's a market, it's a capitalist approach. So it's combining the old command and control with the markets. And what it does is it really allows companies to innovate. It gives them certainty. So that's how Tesla happened. Tesla would not exist today if it weren't for these credits that it was able to sell to the other car companies.
So Tesla was using these credits and it was getting funding?
Yeah, so in that case, so we've done this with a whole bunch of different policies. So the zero-emission vehicle program has what we call tradable credits. The emission standards have tradable credits. And the low carbon fuel standard is a tradable credit program. So the low carbon fuel standard is just for the fuel suppliers. The other one is just for the vehicle suppliers. So I did switch gears a little bit, but with the vehicle, Tesla exists only because of that, because when they first started selling their Model S, they were making about $20,000 from credits that they sold to other car companies for every car they sold.
So that was subsidizing them building each car.
Yeah, it was cross-subsidy, but it wasn't taxpayers paying for it. It was, a cross-subsidy between companies.
Now, in terms of the cost, some people argue that this is increasing the cost of fuel. What are your thoughts on that?
The question about cost of fuels is a tricky one because the cost of oil, it jumps all over the place. It was only a number of years ago, it was $140 a barrel, went down to $30 a barrel. It jumps all over the place. So that's one little insight. The other is we've made our vehicles so much more efficient. When I was a kid, our cars got about 11, 12 miles per gallon. Now they get 30 miles per gallon or more. So therefore, 1 gallon of gas is 3 times as valuable as it was when I was a kid. So yes, when we adopt these policies, it does increase the price of gasoline a little. But the cost of fueling our cars is now probably cheaper than it's ever been in history, going back many decades.
Per mile, is that?
Per mile, yeah, how much we spend for fuel per mile. But it's not a politically correct thing to talk about because affordability is the big issue, which is a legitimate. I mean, there's a lot of people really hurting in this state. We've created a very inequitable society here in California and the US, and that really troubles me. But the gasoline price, I'm not sure that's where we should be from a pure economic or societal perspective.
Before we get to the rest of this interview, this is a time to look at some key headlines in California. In our Epoch Times newspaper this week, California State is passing a law to allow rideshare workers to unionize. Workers who work for Uber and Lyft now, they can unionize. Before, they couldn't do that because they were not full-time employees, and now the requirement has been removed. Governor Newsom is saying he's gonna cut funding to universities who comply with Trump administration. Trump administration is asking universities to limit international students, freeze tuition increases for the next 3 years, and not have preference on gender and race when it comes to admissions and hiring. California State ends Kamala Harris's tenancy law punishing parents. There was a law that passed in 2011 that punishes parents if their kids are missing 10% of school, and the parents could face $2,000 fine or a year in jail and get a misdemeanor for it. The lawmaker mentioned that these policies have failed.
If you find these headlines interesting, there's a lot more in our newspaper. Not only California news, national news, international, and China. And all the stories, we put a lot of effort in making them balanced and include different views. Get a subscription today for $1 by clicking the link below and let us know what you think. Now let's go back to the rest of the interview.
You mentioned that California took these standards to actually show the world what can be done. You were hoping 30-40% of the world would follow. How much of it was to change the world, and how much of it was to impact the local air quality?
So when we started talking about regulating pollution from vehicles, it was all about local air pollution. And it was Los Angeles area and then secondarily the San Joaquin Valley, because they are the 2 most polluted areas in the country and used to be among the most polluted in the world, now much cleaner than it used to be.
But you guys did a great job at that. This CARB has done an amazing job on cleaning up these areas. Like the air in the freeways in Los Angeles is better than any other country, a lot of other countries that I've lived in.
Yeah, I travel a lot. You go to any Asian city, it's much worse than here. You go even to European cities, many, if not most of them, are as bad or worse than LA, and LA started off being far, far worse. So actually, air pollution is one of the most biggest success stories of the human race, what we've done in the last 50 years or so. A gasoline car today is when it's sold, is 99% cleaner than it was 50 years ago before we started doing emission controls. It's a massive engineering success story. And even diesel trucks, we'd sometimes talk about diesel trucks. Trucks are also they're about 97, 98% cleaner than they used to be. So now what happened is, starting about 20 years ago, the legislature passed the first law that said we should pay attention to climate change and greenhouse gases, and it was specifically for vehicles. It was, I believe, 2002. Fran Pavley was the legislator that led it. And starting at that time, gradually these regulations and policies for vehicles started to include climate change, greenhouse gases as part of it. It was a balance of the two. Because at the end of the day, if you go electric, you're solving both problems. So electric is kind of the panacea in a sense. And, right now, politically, it's gotten really complicated because the Trump administration wants to get rid of any rules dealing with climate change. They say, yeah, air pollution is fine, to deal with air pollution, that's good and fine, even though they're relaxing some of those as well. And so partly, the creativity that's happening in the policy world is how do you recraft these policies and rules and incentives solely in terms of air pollution, at least until the end of the Trump administration. But that's where we are now. And the pollution now in California is mostly not from vehicles. It's coming in some places, like at the big warehouses, like in Riverside, where you have so many trucks, big trucks coming there, and some of them are older. You do have, some significant pollution there. And there's a lot of people that live near those, because they put those warehouses near neighborhoods. And so that's a real problem. Ports. In the ports, you've got the problem that the ships coming in, some of them, a lot of them are very polluting. They used to use this, well, they do use mostly what's called bunker fuel, which is the poorest quality oil. It's like the bottom of the product, the worst products in the refineries. They just put it in ships.
You mentioned that we made the cars 99% cleaner, but that 1%, some people argue that costs so much more to do, to go 100%. What are your thoughts on that?
If you look at the vehicle and you're looking at the pollution from it, the more you reduce it, the harder it tends to get. Not always, but generally. Now, yes, the last few percent are always going to be the hardest. Okay, I'm going to say something when I was on that cardboard, I wouldn't have said, is that if we were only concerned about local pollution, we probably could stick with gasoline cars because we've gotten them so clean and we can make sure they stay clean. And I have this vague memory that only 20% of all the pollution and air pollution in California comes from the motor vehicles, even though there's...
So that's low. That's so low now.
Yeah, it's from all these other sources.
There's so many cars going and coming.
Yeah. So they're 99% cleaner, but of course, there's many, many more than there used to be. So it's not altogether, they're not 90% cleaner. But if we're interested in climate change, reducing the pollution emissions from the car, the nitrogen oxides, the hydrocarbons, that doesn't do anything for reducing climate change and greenhouse gases. So that's why
You went to the zero emission.
That's why I went zero emission.
And you guys are doing this with a goal because California has you said 1% of the emissions of the whole world, right? And you were doing this to set an example so the rest of the world will follow. Did they do that? Did you see any progress from the rest of the world?
It did, California indeed has been a leader in the sense that others have followed. So about the same time as California, as CARB was doing the 100% by 2035, Europe was doing the same thing. And Europe, I spent a lot of time talking to the Europeans. In fact, my institute, I have a center in Paris, in Europe, and because we're trading experiences. Part of this is the world has become more connected. And so we were exchanging lessons learned. And they were really encouraged that we in California were doing it. It gave them the confidence to also move ahead. At the same time, we spent a lot of time with the Chinese. And we took our California experience on how to regulate vehicles to the Chinese. And the Chinese really followed the California model to reduce pollution and move to electric vehicles. They did the electric vehicles part better than we did. So what California does, everyone does pay attention to it, both because it's a large market, but also because it's a model that others follow. And actually now Europe has gone past us, China has gone past us.
Why do you think people follow California based on what you've seen?
People follow California because California was the first major government in the world that really tackled air pollution. So this was back in the 1960s, because we did have horrific air pollution. Everyone tells stories about how, you couldn't see the mountains, my wife grew up in LA, she said, there were many days you weren't even allowed to go outside to play outside, that you would get, you would feel sick, and there's lots of research that shows it's really affected people's lung capacity, having been exposed to that. So California really was a leader in dealing with air pollution, and had good reason to do it because the problem was so bad in LA. First of all, California was the leader globally, and then the rest of the country followed. So 1970, Richard Nixon was president, they adopted the Clean Air Act, and that was premised on what California had already done. And part of that Clean Air Act in 1970 said, these are the new rules we're going to adopt. EPA is going to adopt national rules, but you, California, because you're already a leader, you've institutionally set up everything, you've got problems, you're sophisticated, you can go your own way, as long as it's more aggressive than the national. And so since 1970, California has adopted its own emission standards for air pollution that is more aggressive than the rest of the country. And many other states followed it because they had severe air pollution as well. And then Japan followed, Europe followed, but California was the first governmental entity in the world to really take a strong stance in dealing with pollution. And part of it was research, because no one even knew where was the pollution coming from. Was it coming from the trees? That was the kind of famous Ronald Reagan story. Was it coming from, cars, refineries, dry cleaners, how much of it was coming and how did it form? So the research community of California played a huge role in providing the scientific foundation for California taking a leadership and doing smart policy, because, you can do stuff, but if you can do it stupid or you can do it smart. And if you know what you're doing and you have the science, you'll do it more smart. Not always, as smart as it could be or should be, but smarter than it would be otherwise.
Now, speaking of refineries, one of the things that we've covered a lot on the show is the situation with refineries and gas supply. There's a number of them that just announced that they're leaving, they're shutting down. One is shutting down, the other one is just going to import gasoline. And we are hearing that importing is complex. To importing gasoline is more complex than importing oil. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, California is kind of a unique case. One is that we're kind of an isolated fuels market, because we do have a pipeline that goes to Arizona, but basically we don't have any connection to the main refineries on the Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana. So we're kind of physically isolated in terms of pipelines, and pipelines are the cheapest way to move it. We're also isolated in the sense that we have this air pollution problem, so we've adopted rules to make the gasoline cleaner. So the refineries in California make a special kind of gasoline a little bit cleaner than the normal gasoline. And there's very few others in the world that do it. So now you've got, this kind of isolated market, isolated industry. And at the same time, we're being aggressive about moving away from oil, moving to electric vehicles. So how do you manage this? And it's really complicated. So the governor, he got a little too enthusiastic about accelerating the transition to away from oil. And he realized at some point that the transition was not going to happen as fast as he had it in his mind. And the result, he was putting caps on profits. He was making it difficult for the oil companies in many ways. And they said, okay, if you don't want us here, we'll leave. But then there was a realization by the governor that, that's not a good thing either. He issued an order to the California Energy Commission to figure out how to manage this transition in a smarter way that's less disruptive. So that's what's going on right now. And there's been a lot of meetings between the oil industry and government and the regulators and the local governments and the air quality managers. And I think, so there were a whole slew of laws that were passed in the September legislative session in California, 2025. So they're working out a transition. And I think that the transition is going to be more respectful of the oil companies, that, you know, you can't demonize them and punish them and expect them to say, okay, fine, we'll just take it, you know, we're fine. You know, that's not how companies or people operate, right? So they're working out deals with the oil companies to try to keep them. And it's going to be, there's a lot of ideas. I'll come back in a while and we can talk about.
Let us know what we can talk about that. In terms of oil production in California, some of the industry experts have come on the show and told us that we are buying oil from all these countries that are usually they don't have really good governments, but at the same time they're shipping this oil using this bunker fuel, and we could produce it. We could have it from here, and that money will come into California instead of that money going overseas. What are your thoughts on that?
To a tiny extent, that might be true, but mostly not, because the oil fields in California have been drained. It used to be, we got something like 80% of our oil in California. Now it's down to 20%. And the oil produced in California is really low quality. So part of the problem is we've built our refineries to handle really poor quality crude oil, you know, because you got to clean it up and refine it and get your different products from it. And so the oil production part of it is become a pretty small industry. It's important politically because Kern County, where a lot of that production is, depends on that industry. And so there's a lot of political pushback in Kern County to preserve the oil industry, preserve production. So they're going to, you know, there's proposals to allow the oil companies to build more oil wells, but it's going to be a minor amount of oil. It's going to be more that it's going to slow down the fall off of production rather than really increase it. California just doesn't have the ability to really greatly increase production.
Some people are concerned with the refineries that are leaving the state or might be leaving the state. Is there possibility for California to have gas shortage?
I would say there's a possibility of a shortage, but it won't mean we're lining up at the fuel pumps. It'll mean that there'll be some price spikes for gasoline and diesel, probably mostly gasoline. So that is a possibility, and that's what the governor's most worried about, is the price spikes. But there's going to have to be compromises, let's say. You know, it might be we have to compromise a little bit on the quality of the gasoline. We might have to import some gasoline that's not quite as clean as what we have here, for instance.
Do you think the state will be flexible?
You know, end of the day, there's no politician that wants to be there when gasoline prices go up. Remember, even Joe Biden was doing everything he could to keep oil prices down, you know, even at the same time that he was promoting climate change and everything else. So the result of that is I think California will be flexible enough to make sure that there's no dramatic spikes.
In terms of policy making, how is it to be in that shoes? In CARB board members, you know, the Air Resources board members, you guys get criticized by some people really like you. How does it work?
So I'm mostly an academic. I'm not used to being in the public eye, right? Like 15 years ago, we did a revision to the zero-emission vehicle program, you know, before the 100% one. And I was seen as a leader of it along with Mary Nichols. the LA Times did a story about how I had this conflict of interest because I had funding from car companies in my research institute, and that therefore I was compromised, and who was I to be adopting regulations because it wasn't reflecting the public interest. And that was something that was scary to me, to be written up, featured, targeted, in the LA Times. And my boss, Mary Nichols, the chair, who was very experienced, she said, people know you, people respect you, you have a lot of credibility, let it go, don't make a big issue out of it, and it'll go away. And she was right. So I gained a little appreciation for politicians, when they're doing damage control, how do you deal with it? But it's kind of frightening for someone like one of us, me, to be targeted like that.
When you were making these policies, were you concerned getting it wrong?
Yeah, when you're up there and you're making the decision, you feel a tremendous responsibility. You want to do it right, but you do need to be sensitive to how it's going to impact people. So my wife, who was actually vice chair of CARB at the time, she came from industry. And her job always was, for every regulation came up, she said, okay, what does that mean for the small businesses? What does that mean for the small companies? How is it going to affect them? And so we had a lot of pillow talk on that, but we as a board address that a lot. And it is a heavy responsibility. You want to do the right thing, and balancing what seems like an important goal. So actually what you learn is there's a lot of goals. So CARB's goal is air pollution and climate, but it's increasingly also equity. But also you need to worry about economics. You need to worry about jobs. And balancing all of that is hard, is really hard. And I know I personally struggled with that a lot, and wanted to make sure that what we were doing, wouldn't come back to bite us, in the sense of being a bad regulation or politically bad, or, and we're worried about the credibility of the institution. One of the things that really troubles me in today's world is we need strong institutions that are respected, whether it's a judicial system, whether it's the Air Resources Board, it's a legislature. We, as a society, we're not going to function well if those institutions aren't strong and respected. And that was a special responsibility, And so I did have some concerns about going too far in some cases, and that weighed heavily on me.
UC Davis professor Daniel Sperling, it was great to have you on California Insider.
It's been a pleasure sharing this forum here with you, because this is so important, what we're talking about.
Let us know what you think about this interview with Dr. Daniel Sperling. You can always email siamak@californiainsider.com or comment. We read all of your emails and comments. I'm Siamak Khorrami, this is California Insider, and we'll see you next time.